Hello and welcome to Pennwriters Presents. I am Joy Givens and I am delighted to be joined today by author and editor and woman of all kinds of creations, Mary Fan. Thank you for being here, Mary.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'd like to just start by kind of getting to know you a little better. So could you tell us a little bit about how you got started in your creative career? What sort of projects you like to work on, other interests besides writing, anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a writer and editor based in Jersey City. I mostly do science fiction and fantasy, and within those, mostly young adult literature, though I have ventured into other age categories and genres as well. I got started when I was shortly out of college. This would have been about 2011 or 2012. And I'd been a fan of sci-fi fantasy like since I was, a kid. I mean, I actually do remember what got me into sci-fi specifically was when I was about, I must have been like 9 or 10. There was a TV show called Wishbone in which, a little dog would, tell kids about classic literature, and the dog would play.
I love Wishbone.
Yeah. Oh
I grew up on Wishbone too.
Yeah. And I'm like, I love that show. And they had these tie-in books where they would explore additional stories, and one of them was Legion of Space, which is a classic 1930s sci-fi novel. And I just remember I read the Wishbone version and was like, this is really cool, I want to check out the real version now. And so I did, and that just started sort of a lifelong love of sci-fi. And because I loved it so much, of course I had to try writing it myself. And I think I wrote my first sci-fi novel when I was 12, and it was not very good in hindsight, but I was very proud of myself for finishing. But it wasn't until, thanks. But it wasn't until after college that I finally sat down to try to write seriously. Yeah, I guess that's how I got started. And my first book came out in 2013, which feels like so long ago now.
It does. Yeah. Because you didn't major in creative writing in college. You majored in music. Is that right?
That's right. And in fact, my college's creative writing department rejected me 3 times.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm still bitter about that.
Understandably. I'm probably not as bitter as they are at this point, but
I like to think it's because I'm a genre writer and they're literary people.
Sure. Yeah. So what you kind of explained the start of your love of sci-fi and speculative fiction, but what as an adult and as a writer professional now, what do you love about that genre? What keeps and piques your interest?
With sci-fi specifically, I don't know why. I've always been drawn to it more than fantasy. And I was thinking really hard about this the other day because, sometimes I just think about these things. And I really think it's because fantasy is oftentimes based on the past. It kind of rose out of this desire for more mythology. I think when Tolkien wrote, The Lord of the Rings, which is kind of a foundational fantasy work, he was trying to create a mythology for, the UK that didn't quite exist yet. And it was borrowing from a lot of older stuff that came before that. So yeah, fantasy tends to look to the past for inspiration, whereas sci-fi arose from people looking to the future and thinking, what if we could go to the moon? What if, people from other planets visited? And I'm I think that might be why I tend to gravitate more towards sci-fi. And also sci-fi lets you explore where you want things to go. It's not packed with as much baggage as fantasy can be sometimes. I think that's just a matter of you're writing fantasy that comes with certain expectations because it, comes from existing myths and this whole canon that we have. Whereas with sci-fi, you can kind of leave some of that behind and envision something better.
That is a really great way to summarize it. And thank you. Yeah. And you're right. When I personally don't read a ton of sci-fi. My husband loves sci-fi. So I get some by association too. But a few years ago, several now, I read Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis. And it was about space exploration, but prior to actual space exploration taking place in the 20th century. And it was so interesting to me to read what he envisioned space to be like. He thought it would be full of light and really, really warm, because you were closer to the sun. So it's just this golden light would fill your space capsule. And I was like, that's really cool. And now we know that, like, strictly speaking, he was wrong, at least on Earth. But what a cool way to envision something that you haven't, that there's just literally no foundation for.
Yeah, and I guess that's the cool thing about living in, what was for those kinds of authors, like the mid-century authors, the far future is, it hasn't turned out the way they predicted, but it's kind of cool to see like what they thought would happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Now, in addition to your own fiction writing, sci-fi, you also are an editor, co-editor of the Brave New Girls anthology series.
Yes, that's right. And our most recent one came out in late July, Tales of Girls Who Tech and Tinker.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And it's a collection of short stories. There's 29 in the most recent one. And they're all about tech-savvy girls in sci-fi worlds. So it's like girls who fix robots or, hack evil corporations or, fight robot overlords, like fun little tales like that.
That's awesome. And from a, like, building that anthology standpoint, can you take me through kind of what it was like to go from concept to execution of the first anthology and what kind of guided your structure of it? Like, because it's all different authors, it's all different characters. It's not like a series of characters that you follow. So what made you choose the path that you did?
So it started, I think, in early 2014. So my partner on this project is Paige Daniels, who's also a sci-fi writer. And we were just having a conversation one day, kind of complaining about the lack of, I guess, smart girls in fiction in like a heroine's role. Like usually when you see those kinds of characters, they're relegated to some kind of supporting role, like, they're just the girl in the lab or something. And we kind of wanted to bring them to the forefront, partially because, we felt there should be more stories like that, and also to encourage more real world girls to, explore STEM. So that's why with our anthologies, we actually donate the proceeds to the Society of Women Engineers Scholarship Fund. And we were like, we want lots of stories, just all different kinds of stories, all different kinds of girls, all different kinds of worlds. Let's make an anthology with multiple authors and each one's a standalone. And also this way, because our audience is kids, sometimes it can be hard for a kid to pick up, a 400-page book. Whereas this is like, just a collection of short stories. Each one is only like 10,000 words long. So, if you're looking at this giant book, you might be intimidated, but it's like, oh no, it's just like this little story. It's only like that big.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and that's such a good point for short fiction, right? For reluctant readers, among younger readers or older, or for older readers who don't have the time necessarily or inclination to sit down with a whole novel, to give them those bite-sized pieces that they can enjoy. That's really great.
Yeah, thanks. And also it was important for us to have like variety, to show that there's lots of different ways to be a heroine. Like you can, be, the classic kick-ass heroine, going out into like a battle, or you could be, the girl at home behind her computer, like, solving math problems. Like there's lots of different ways to be a heroine.
That's a very good point. And I bet it's freeing within your anthologies to be able to showcase all those that range of female heroism without being tied to specific characters or locked into a framework.
Yeah, that was really important for us.
Yeah. Have you noticed anything about your work as a writer that has changed because of your work as an editor, your experiences in evaluating, compiling other stories? Has that changed the way you think about your own work?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to, look at your own work the same way you would look at someone else's. At the same time, I definitely think I am a lot more willing to, I guess, just slash, burn, and destroy when it comes to the process. I guess because, I've had to tell writers to do that, and I've had editors tell me to do that, and so I've gotten more used to it now, like in the earlier stages. So, when I wrote my first book, for example, I wrote the whole thing. I thought it had to be perfect, and then, later on realized, the ending was wrong, and then later an editor told me some of the scenes, the order was wrong. I just remember being like, no, I don't want to rewrite all that. But you get used to it, and also when you're the one telling others to do it, like, you have to be able to take it if you're giving it, and so now I'm much better about it.
That's fair. Yeah, it feels a little bit like writing karma sometimes. You're like, why did I tell other people to cut things, and now I have to cut them? But it does help to think of it more from a selling the story standpoint and think what's effective to the story.
Yeah, and also getting the reader perspective, because when you're writing, you're so into it that everything just feels natural to you. But, especially in sci-fi, when you're making things up, you can mention a device and you know what it is, but no one else is going to. And I've read, plenty of submissions where it's like, okay, this thing sounds really cool, but I have no idea what it is because I am not you. So please insert an explanation. And now, like, when I read over my own work, if I catch something like that, I'm like, oh no, someone who's not me would have no idea what that is. I should insert an explanation.
Yeah. It heightens that awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Neat. Well, what are you working on now?
I am currently working on an entirely new work in progress. It's still very vague because I'm still in the outlining stages. This one is a fantasy, actually, and it's set underwater in this other fantasy realm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So kind of like the same sort of groundwork setting as like Atlantis type story, like an underwater civilization.
Yeah, exactly. The idea being that, the beings who live in this underwater society, they're not water breathers. They are people like us. And yeah, Atlantis is a good metaphor because I actually love the Disney version of Atlantis, and that's kind of what inspired it. Because in that world, you have this underwater civilization where, they're people like us. They don't breathe water, and they've been trapped underwater for centuries. And I was like, well, what if it wasn't just one city? What if it was a whole civilization like that? Like some cataclysm thousands of years ago, buried all of them. And now they have, I guess it's a little bit like living in space because, instead of spaceships, you would have submarines, but you can't go outside because the crush of the water would destroy you, just like space would.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting.
Thanks.
That sounds exciting. To my claustrophobic mind, I feel a little nervous, but it sounds really cool.
Yeah, it's just a setting I hadn't explored before, so I wanted to try something new. I've done space, I've done sort of traditional fantasy, like land-based fantasy, and I was like, what haven't I done? Let's go underwater.
Yeah, well, that's great. Now I have to ask, did you get this idea during quarantine when we are all separated and bubbled?
No, but it definitely made it weirder. The idea came about, I think it was about a year ago. It actually started out with me wanting to write a circus story because outside of writing, I do some circus arts. I do flying trapeze and aerial silks. And of course, when you're a writer and you have a hobby, you want to write about the hobby. So I really wanted to write a circus story, but me being me, it had to be sci-fi or fantasy. And I was like, well, I don't really want to do an old-timey fantasy with a traveling circus because I feel like that's been done before. And I just wasn't very interested in that kind of idea. So I was like, what if it's a space circus? And I was like, or what if it's an underwater circus?
Awesome.
Thanks.
That just sounds really fresh and exciting.
I hope so, once I write it.
Oh yeah, the easy part. You've got the idea. Oh, well, thinking about quarantine, thinking about what 2020 has been for all of us, how has 2020 impacted you as a creator, as somebody who's trying to produce work and produce other people's work during this time when we're all so distanced and stressed and scared?
So on a practical front, I feel like I'm luckier than most because I have a day job and I was able to go remote because it was one of those, white collar desk jobs. And I will say when quarantine was first announced and we thought it was only going to be 2 weeks, I was kind of excited because I was like, hey, I get to work from home, no commute, no commitments. I can just, do my day job during those 8 hours, don't have to spend an hour on the train and then dive right back into my book work. I didn't realize how distracting the pandemic could be, and that instead of spending that extra time working on books, I would just spend it trolling the interwebs for any news or anything, and just kind of, what do they call it? Doom scrolling.
Yes, doom scrolling, absolutely.
So yeah, so I was not as productive as I thought I would be, and then of course, as it dragged on, it was even more just oh my goodness, we're never going to get out of here, and that starts to affect the way you write. So I was actually in the middle of writing the third book of my dystopian trilogy at the time. And it was already going to be a pretty bleak book because it's the third book of a dystopian trilogy. But I think it turned out even bleaker because I was writing it in quarantine. Like, you can just
Sure.
sense that I was in a bad mood.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
It's the story.
Wow. Yeah. Did you find that it made you feel better writing something? Like, was it cathartic? And then you kind of come out of that world like, okay, I'm back in 2020, but at least it's not this. Or were you like, oh no, I stopped writing and I'm still in 2020?
I guess it was cathartic because ultimately I was getting something done. And, you know, when you have nothing else to do, it felt good to like create something, you know, for a change instead of just doom scrolling all day.
Yeah. Yeah. The news that we have access to on a constant basis can be very draining.
Yeah.
Have you seen, either in yourself or in the work that you've looked at from others, have you seen any kind of shift in where work is going? Any like current events or news that's kind of bleeding back into that sort of life imitates art, imitates life?
You know what's funny is that I feel like a lot of writers of dystopia right now are feeling a little weird about their works. So for example, my friend Paige Daniels, who's my co-editor for Brave New Girls, she wrote a cyberpunk trilogy that I think the last book came out in like 2015, 2016. Like, it's been out for a while. But in it, the government is trying to put chips into people to track them and actually manufactures a plague in order to give people a vaccine with the chip.
Oh
Yeah.
no!
Awkward, right? Like, now, I swear that wasn't meant to be a conspiracy theory. At the time, it was just like an interesting dystopian premise. But yeah,
Yeah.
it was like a little weird for her to try to promote that book when you have people who are actually thinking this is something that could happen if we ever get a vaccine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
My dystopian trilogy, originally the premise was, so it's a YA trilogy, and originally the premise was you had these teenagers who were told that there was like this worldwide pandemic and that they had it and they were going to die by the time they were 20, and then they're kept in like this dome city, and then it was going to be revealed that it was all a lie.
Uh-huh.
I ended up changing the premise of that, and I'm really glad, because if I were trying to promote the third book of that right now, the way the story would have played out is probably that by this point in the story, the kids would probably be trying to reveal the truth of the fake pandemic. And I'm like, thank God I am not
Yeah.
right now. It's
Yeah.
weird.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Oh, I'm just thinking about like the potential impact of that and wow.
Yeah, like, you know, when I came up with the premise in like 2013, it just seemed like, you know, a fun sort of Hunger Games-y type of dystopian premise. And then I ended up changing it on the advice of like an editor who said at the time that there's too much dystopia, make it something less obviously dystopian. And, you know, there's always been like, whenever you change a book, there's always, oh, what if I'd gone in that other direction? And right now I'm just like, thank God.
For sure. Wow. Yeah. Well, let's see. We're in the back half of 2020 now. We're limping to the end of 2020. So as we come out of this year into the continuing new decade that we sort of tripped at the starting blocks of, what are you hopeful for about the future, both for yourself and for the industry? And what are you concerned about? Like, as we move out of this weird time kind of back to a baseline of normal, what do you hope to see and what do you hope not to see?
So this pandemic has really thrown into like sharp relief some of the inequalities that are in the world. And you've seen that kind of with the George Floyd protests, that I think part of the reason why they gained so much power is because, you know, there was already so much inequality because of the pandemic. And then you have this high profile murder, and then people just sort of like snapped and they went out and they called for justice.
Yeah.
And I am hopeful that that momentum will carry through even as things return to normal, and that they're not going to return to normal. It's not going to return to what it was like in 2019. There's going to be a new normal, and I'm hopeful that it's going to be more equal. You know, it's going to be more aware of the injustices so that it can correct those injustices, both in real life and in publishing, which is still, you know, there's just a lot of biases that are deeply entrenched in this industry that is, what, something like 80% white or something like that, which
Yeah.
of course, the kinds of stories that get published. So there is a real push for that, and I hope it continues. What I worry about, though, is that there have been pushes like this before, and it's usually some cataclysm that caused them to stop. Like if you remember the 90s, there was a huge push for diversity then too. You know, you had the Rainbow Coalition, you had every single TV show seemed to want a diverse cast because it was uncool to not have any people of color in your cast. And then something happened, and like you look at the 2000s and suddenly everything is lily white again, and you're like, so what happened between the 90s and the 2000s? Oh, September 11th, and the War on Terror and all that, because what tends to happen is that when there's some cataclysm like that, people get scared, and when they get scared, they retreat back into the known. So all that optimism from the 90s, all that push for change, like suddenly people were terrified and they were like, I don't want change, I just want something safe. And so that's why you had that retreat. So I do worry that even with this current push, because the pandemic is so traumatizing, that we'll see some of that retreat, and especially since the book industry is suffering right now like everybody else. People are buying books, but it's not the same as, you know, back when we had bookstores and back when you had events and such. And, you know, when publishers have less money, they tend to be more conservative with their money and more conservative with their politics.
Yes, that's a really good point. And that's very interesting to think about it from like that kind of eagle-eye view of where we've been and how it is cyclical. That's a really good point. In thinking about the initiatives that have been going on, either through social media or otherwise lately with publishing, things like Publishing Paid Me, Publishing So White, We Need Diverse Books, all of these pushes toward greater equality and equity in the industry. What do you think is working or not working?
I think it's certainly working when it seems like the readers are pushing for some of these things as well. Like it does matter, you know, which books sell. That's why there was that push, I think it was early June, for the Blackout bestseller list, where it's like, let's make the entire New York Times bestseller list, you know, books by Black authors, to prove to publishing that these books do sell, and therefore you should be acquiring them, you should be publishing them and publicizing them. Like, don't just publish them to make yourself feel better and then let them sink. Like, put behind them the kind of like marketing machine that you've seen for other books in the past. Yeah, and I think it definitely works when people, you know, vote with their wallets, and, you know, when they're outspoken on the internet, because there is a cultural impact that that can have. People complain a lot about Twitter mobs and cancel culture and blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of people tweeting. Like, nobody's getting their heads chopped off, like, going to jail, like, it's just people tweeting. And if the impact is that, you know, a book gets canceled, well, it's probably because that book should never have been acquired in the first place. That's
a very good point. Yeah, and I'm glad you point out, when we think about cancel mobs on Twitter, that at their heart, they're consumers, they're customers. And if what we want is, you know, free enterprise in this industry, then it is more an issue of entitlement of, well, this book deserves to get published, so publish it, versus maybe it shouldn't have been in the first place. Maybe it's problematic. And there's a difference between a mob with pitchforks and a mob with smartphones.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's also the publisher's decision. Like, none of these people on Twitter can physically storm a publisher's office and say, don't you dare publish that book. Like, and there have been cases where the publisher has just been like, sorry, book's out.
Yeah, it's true. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting time to be in publishing, and it's an interesting time to really be working on anything fictional, just given how wild and crazy nonfiction is right now.
Yeah, and I've seen some debate among authors of contemporary young adult fiction. Like, they're like, what are we going to do? Like, you know, we wrote these books back in 2018, 2019, you know, before there was a pandemic. And of course, the way teenagers are living now is that, you know, it's all Zoom classes and virtual workouts. Like, what are we going to do? And the answer seems to be, for a lot of these authors, is just pretend there is no pandemic, because, you know, their stories were written in a different era, it kind of feels like, and it was a product of its time. I don't know about anyone who's currently writing contemporary, because that is weird. Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to make it about the pandemic? Are you going to pretend it's like a year after the pandemic? Like, this is why I don't write contemporary.
Yeah. I hear you. I write contemporary middle grade, so I feel it. But yeah, to think about the impact that this year will have on the way on our collective worldview, and the way that we describe things that are normal. Like, will future books have people shaking hands when they meet? Will they have plexiglass in stores? Wondering what will stay and what won't. It's almost kind of like thinking about sci-fi in a way, picturing the future, in our everyday lives now, what it will look like. And it's weird.
Yeah, I guess there's also like just thinking about, how long will these pandemic times last? I mean, if you're going to write, like a contemporary middle grade and it's not going to come out for like another 2 or 3 years because of the publishing cycle, like by the time it comes out, like it might be over. Like we might not be wearing.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully we're out of it. Yeah.
Yep. So it's like, do you write about that and you're trying to capture 2020, or do you just like, let's fast forward a year or two and not have masks, not have, hand sanitizer everywhere?
Yeah. Oh man, yeah. So do you have, aside from Brave New Girls, the 5th volume, which you said it's girls who tinker and tech and tinker. Okay.
We decided to use tech as a verb because we decided that if they can use science as a verb, we can use tech as a verb.
Yes, definitely. I would say you can verb that for sure. Aside from that recent release, do you have any kind of planned upcoming releases on the horizon? This 3rd book in your trilogy, when is that slated for release?
So that came out in the end of August, in ebook and paperback. The hardback is following. I'm not sure exactly when it's coming out because my printer is in China and just shipping times are weird nowadays. So it's like, yeah, it'll get here when it gets here, basically. Like, originally, I'd hoped to release all 3 versions at the same time, but A, like kind of being pandemic distracted meant that I didn't finish my manuscript on time. And then B, like pandemic screwing up shipping everywhere. I was like, you know what? I'm not going to kill myself trying to get my manuscript done in time when I don't even know if the printer's going to be able to ship them in time. So.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Yeah. And you make a good point for an industry that is so like hurry up and wait, like with these big waiting for a response, waiting for edits, waiting for whatever, and then that push to get back. It's hard to adhere to that rigid system when it feels like there are no rules for anything right now. It just feels like there's no structure like there used to be. I wonder if that will stay too. We'll see.
I hope not. I miss structure.
Yeah, I do too. We call it Blur's Day at my house. Every day is Blur's Day in quarantine.
That's a good one. I'm going to steal that. It's Blur's Day.
Yeah. Well, that's about the questions that I have, formal questions overall. My last question is, what advice at this point in your career would you give to either your younger self, like that straight out of college writer, or someone at any age or stage who's just starting out as a writer? What do you think is important to know?
I would say it's important to know that publishing is not as much of a meritocracy as it likes to pretend it is. Like, you hear all the time, oh, we publish the best books. Like, it's all about merit. It's all about like the quality of the writing. And that's just not true because it's such a subjective industry. I mean, reading is such a subjective activity that there really is no better or worse. It's just who likes what more and who in power likes what more. So I would tell my younger self and any, early writers out there, if you've done your best and you've written something you're really proud of and it's not getting picked up, it's not necessarily because it's not a good book. It might just be you weren't lucky enough to find that magic moment, like connect with that right agent or editor or, hit that right trend. Like it could just be luck. And so like, don't kill yourself over it. Like, don't worry too much about, what am I doing wrong? Because sometimes it literally isn't you.
Sure. Yeah, and like you said, it's about the moment. It's about hitting that right project at that right time with that right person.
Right.
It's like lightning.
Yeah. And because publishing is like an apprenticeship based industry, you have a senior editor who, takes an assistant editor under their wing and like trains them. And then eventually that assistant becomes a full blown editor. But they probably internalize a lot of that older editor's tastes, point of views and stuff. And those are not, objective grounds for like merit or quality or anything. That's just that editor's opinion of what's good. And that's getting passed along. And that's why you have so many entrenched biases in publishing, because they literally get passed along.
That's a really good point. When you think about the trickle down from one person in the chain to the next, how ideas are transferred along with knowledge within the industry. It's a very good point. Anything else you'd like to share about your experiences, your process for putting together a story, or the way that you go through the process of revision?
Sure. So I guess I recently finished writing, like I said, just finally released the last book of my dystopian trilogy. And the thing I've learned over the course of that is that your writing habits can change. So I started writing that trilogy in 2013. It took a while to come out, the first one, because it just sort of went through a lot. And over the course of 7 years, I have changed as a writer. At the beginning, I was very much dependent on a lot of notes. And I think it's because the idea of a blank page terrified me. And now sometimes I will just make things up. I'll have an outline and then I'll get to a chapter and I'll be like, I don't like that outline anymore. I'm just going to write something else. So I guess I would say, especially to early writers, don't be too rigid in your process, because processes do change and it's important just to go with what feels right.
Really good advice too. Yeah, not to hold yourself to something just because it worked in the past or just because it seems like the right way.
Yeah, and just because it worked in the past and it's not working now, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It could just be you've changed as a writer.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Oh, well, thank you so much, Mary. It has just been a delight talking with you.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Any links you'd like to drop? Any information you'd like to share? Things that you'd like people to check out and look up, or anything like that?
So my website, it's very easy. It's just my name, maryfan.com. And on there's just a list of all my books, everything I've edited. It's all there. Links to my social media. So yeah, maryfan.com.
Wonderful. I just have to ask, do you have a favorite project? Do you have anything that you've worked on that just still sticks with you the most, knowing how prolific you are?
Oh, that's hard. I mean, it's like picking a favorite child, which I know is a cliche at this point, but we all have our favorites. And I do think Starswept, that first book in the dystopian trilogy, it's still special to me. And I think, I don't know, for a couple of reasons. One is the story when I wrote it. I remember when I wrote, how sometimes you have that project and when you're writing it, you just think, oh my God, I love it. I still feel that warm, fuzzy feeling about it. It's so easy to be self-critical. And that was the one where, as I was writing it, I was just like, no, I'm not going to criticize it. I just like it. And I love the way it came out. It was also my first time independently publishing a book. And I was going to go for it. I had a custom photo shoot. I got it, hardback printed with, a foil cover and stuff like that. And actually making the physical book was almost as much fun as writing it was, because I love books as physical objects. That's why, even though I perfectly respect anybody who likes an e-reader, I personally want paper. I like to hold it, and I actually get kind of nitpicky when I see a paper book that clearly hasn't been thought through. I'm like, this person just hit print on their Word doc, huh? They didn't think about, the chapter heads and the little scene dividers and the page numbers. And so, yeah, Starswept was my first chance to kind of produce a book as an art project in and of itself, besides the words. And so it's special.
Awesome. That's great. So anybody who is going to maryfan.com could start with Starswept.
Yeah. In fact, when I'm at conventions and I have, a table full of books and they're like, where should I start? Which one's your favorite? That's the one where I'm like, well, this one's my favorite. You should check it out.
Awesome. Oh. Well, thank you so much, Mary, and best of luck with the rest of 2020 and beyond. We certainly look forward to seeing what you come up with next. And if you're ever in the great state of Pennsylvania, let Pennwriters know. We would love to see you in person when we can all see each other in person again.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, good luck with the remainder of 2020, this wild, wild year.
Yes, it is. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the feed now. So thank you so much again, Mary. And I am Joy Gibbons for Pennwriters Presents.